nothing to say that, you know, having a wide vibrato is better than having this kind of BB King type vibrato and everything in between. Hey, John here. When it comes to guitar playing, one of the most important things is the vibrato. Doesn't really matter how flashy and technical your overall playing is if everyone goes whenever you stop on a note. So to help you with that, I'm going to share an exercise that I learned secondhand from John Petrucci himself, and I'm going to explain to you why I know this and how this came about. So when I was studying at GIT in 95, 96, I saw a poster outside of the school where it said John Petrucci lessons, and I was like, what? Because I was a huge John Petrucci fanboy at that point. As I got closer to the poster on the telephone pole, I could see that while John Petrucci and lessons were in big print, there was smaller print as well. And basically what it said was that this guy, Eric, was a former student of John Petrucci, and now he's giving lessons in the Los Angeles area. I was such a massive John Petrucci fanboy at that point, so I didn't really care that this guy might be full of shit. So I ripped the tab off. It was an old school thing. You rip the tab off with the number, and then I called him. Long story short, it turned out that he was actually an old student of Petrucci after all, as he introduced me to Petrucci at the Lexicon booth at the NAMM in '96. So that was kind of cool to get that confirmation. But regardless, he shared a lot of good things, so I'm happy I took the lessons. So this exercise really helped me a lot, so I'm happy to pass this on to you guys. Alright, so the purpose of this exercise is to give you control over your vibrato. And what that means is that you get control over the pitch, meaning how far you bend, because the vibrato is really a series of controlled bends, as you're going to see, and also control over the actual timing of it. Because if you don't have control over the actual pitch, meaning how much you fluctuate in pitch, it's gonna sound crazy. Same thing if you don't have control over the timing. So here's an example of getting the timing right, but the pitch wrong. So let's say I want to do a vibrato on this note, and I want to do, you know, around a half step. And if I get the timing right, meaning I don't fluctuate, I don't do anything weird with the timing, it's fairly even, but I get the vibrato, I get the bending pitch wrong, it's gonna sound kind of crazy. So I'm just gonna have an even rhythm here, but I'm gonna vary the width of the vibrato. Right? You can hear that it sounds very disconcerting. So you don't want that at all. Now, on the other hand, if you don't get the rhythm right, it's also gonna sound crappy. So even though I'm gonna be very consistent in terms of how big my vibrato is, in this case, going up and down a half step, if I then add a kind of a weird rhythm to it, you know, it's not gonna sound good. And this is not to say that you cannot vary the width of the vibrato and the rhythm as you do a vibrato, but you want to do that gradually. So try to think of a singer and how they phrase. And generally, if it's a good singer, he or she will have control of the vibrato in a musical way. And that usually means that they might change the speed of the vibrato, the width of the vibrato, but it's not going to be this sudden change. So keep that in mind as you work on this. So now you know what not to do. So let's just dive into what to do instead. So what I consider the ideal position for vibrato is the opposite of having the fingers like this, because what you want is to put your hand over the top like this. So I'm actually having no gap in between here. And then I place my finger here, the third finger, on the 11th fret. So if you try that over at your place. So like that. So this is what I want it to look like. Not this. Just like that. And the reason we want the thumb here is because we're going to bend against that. And the bend here is going to come from turning the wrist. So it's like turning the key in a lock or a doorknob. So you don't want to use your fingers like this. That's usually a very bad habit. You don't need to be super tense, but you don't want them to be flopping around either, because the purpose of the fingers is you have to keep the string in place, and then you move the string by turning your wrist. And if you do that, you're going to find that it's not that hard to do this consistently. But if you start introducing the fingers, you're really going to be working against yourself, and that's not a good thing. So again, we're here on the 11th fret of the B string, and we're gonna bend up from 11 to 12. You might think like, well, this is not a bending tutorial, it's a vibrato tutorial, but all a vibrato is a series of bends. And especially when you start on a note and bend up, because yeah, then basically your pitch is gonna go up the whole time, right? So that's why having a whammy bar is gonna sound different and more musical, I think, because you can also go below the pitch. And also that's why when you bend up to a note, it sounds more musical than if you just do the same vibrato on that note, but that way, because you only get 50%. But that doesn't really matter, because the technique, whether I'm going, if I'm bending up to the note and doing the vibrato, or doing the vibrato from the note itself, still gonna be the same technique in terms of twisting my wrist. So you don't need to really worry about that right now. And I'm gonna have another lesson where I'm gonna go more into bends, specifically, and bends and vibrato. But if you have this vibrato technique down already, it's going to be way easier for you to incorporate both. So we have the thumb over the top, the finger should be placed like this, and the index finger is very important. As you can see, I'm not on the B string, I'm actually on the G string here, and I'm not fretting it either like this. I'm just basically resting on top of it, because if you don't do that, you're going to find that it's easy to sort of get under the G string or whatever string you're bending up towards. So having that index finger is going to serve two things. It's going to mute the string, so you're not going to get any extraneous noise. And also you're going to keep the string away from the bend or vibrato in this case. So if you have that in place, that's great. And you can see you have sort of an angle here on the fingers as well, as opposed to this, when you're just trying to play scales and things like that. So you want to keep the fingers rigid, but not super strict, but just relaxed basically. And a very important thing to think about here is that whatever finger you have behind the finger you're doing the vibrato with, that needs to help to push the string. That will make it way easier. Which is also why it's actually easier to do vibrato with the pinky in most cases, because then you have more fingers behind helping. So the index finger will always be resting on the string below, you know, basically as the fingertip on that, and I'm not pushing down like I said. But then the second finger is going to be on the B string, helping me, you know, move the string. But again, the purpose of the fingers here is just to hold the string in place, and then the wrist is doing all the work. So I hope you can see that I'm doing this twisting motion. And you can also think about the palm of your hand pushing towards the bottom of the neck here. Your palm will never reach the actual neck though, because that will probably break a string. So you don't need to go that far. See if you can see it from this angle. You see, here's my palm. That's a half step, a whole step would be. I'm still way off from hitting the fretboard here. So even if I do 1.5 step, it's not gonna be even close to hitting the fretboard. Now we're getting to the actual exercise. Now we have that technical stuff out of the way. So again, no finger movements at all. You just chuck your hand like this, and then you're gonna twist your wrist towards the bottom of the fretboard without hitting the fretboard, because then you probably break a string. All right, so you want to be able to do this with all fingers. That's very important. My general rule is when I'm on the wound strings, so the E, A, and D in my case, I will bend towards the floor. And the reason being here, if I bend towards the ceiling on the E string, I'm gonna get that, right? Not very cool. And then the same thing goes, but in the opposite direction when it comes to the thinner strings. If I bend up here, that's great, but if I bend down, not that great. So that's basically how I divide it. But there's also times when I would go with the index finger. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's just a general thing to think about. And as long as you're not doing anything crazy, you can get away with a lot of things, both up and down, depending on what string you're on. But in general, try to keep that in mind. So up when it's on the thinner strings, and down when it's on the thicker strings. So here's how to do the exercise. We're gonna start with the third finger because that's the easiest one, I think. And then you can apply it to the other fingers after. So let's just start here on the 11th fret, since we've been doing that already on the B string. So now we want to bend this note up a half step. And that's very important. You want to keep that in pitch. So if you're unsure, just go and then mimic that with the bend. And you want to keep this in time. So I think eighth notes is the best to start with, because then it's very easy to know where if you're in time or not. So basically I just go like this. So what I'm doing here, I'm going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So when I'm bending up, my foot is up as well. So basically I'm starting on the string, on the beat, so my foot is down. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. As you can hear now, it just sounds like a series of bends, but that's what a vibrato is anyways. If I speed it up. But when you've done this at a slower tempo, you're gonna find, just like my other approaches when it comes to technique in general, if you do it slow, you program the correct technique into your body and your brain, and then when you speed it up, it will be much easier. So just choose a tempo that feels all right, and you can do this correctly. That's the most important thing. So don't freak out about specific tempos. Just start slow and then try a bunch of different tempos. But the idea is to get this correct motion in, and then once you have that, that's when the fun begins, and you can actually start applying this and use more of a listening approach when you listen to other guitar players, and then you have the technical equipment to actually do what they're doing, instead of doing the thing that you probably have ran into if you're actually watching this video and you have trouble with your vibrato. You probably ran into this thing where you start bending, or you start having a vibrato, and then it sort of peters out. So you go like, you start changing your technique and you try all you can with your fingers or whatever. So that's what we want to avoid here. We want to make sure we can get a vibrato that's consistent, where you can just keep it going for as long as you want. So when you do this exercise, the question that pops up for my students most of the time is like, how often do I re-pick the string? That's going to depend on your sound. If you do this without an amp, for example, if I do this, then I have to re-pick it more often. If I have this kind of sound, I don't need to do that as often. So that's, really up to what kind of tone you're using. All right, so that was the third finger. Now for the second finger, it's going to be basically the same, but you don't have anything to support you in terms of pushing the strings, so it can be a slight bit harder. Same idea though, you want to make sure you get the pitch as correct as possible. So you decide on a half step or a whole step. I would suggest a half step at first, and then you get used to that, and then basically just keep it to strict eighth notes. A very rigid rhythm in that sense, but again, we're doing this to develop the control. And now the index finger is even trickier, but it's definitely doable anyway. So you just have to be a bit more careful with the string below. So what I tend to do, make sure that I'm not exactly on the fingertip here, so I'm actually going to hit the G string in this case every time I bend, but not so much that it's going to make it ring, but it's basically going to mute it a bit. So basically the same thing. And now the pinky then, it's going to be the easier one, I think, because now you have two fingers helping on the same string, and actually the pinky is very strong. If you do this, you're going to feel like this whole muscle here is helping your pinky. So the lack of pinky control is just that. It's not strength, it's just that you're not used to using the pinky. You've sort of skipped it and not actually applied it in your technique practice. But that's easily reversible as well, but I have other videos for that. All right, so the pinky. So same idea. just rhythmically correct. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... So you can see it's quite rigid and strict in the way that I'm doing it now, but again, that's to develop the control. But as you apply this to a musical context, it won't sound that way once you got the technique going. Then you can let your ear guide you. And I'm gonna talk more about that in a later video as well. But you're gonna find that once you got the actual sort of technical equipment in place here, it's gonna be way easier to do the kind of vibrato that you like. So I want to end on that, where there's nothing to say that, you know, having a wide vibrato is better than having this kind of BB King type vibrato and everything in between. That's a subjective thing. That's what you like. So don't let anyone tell you that, like, oh, I don't like a vibrato. If your vibrato is technically sound and you're not doing any weird things like stuff like that, and that wasn't your intention, then don't listen. It's up to what you like. Otherwise, it's just like trying to placate other people and like, oh, you should play like this. And like, why? You can play like that. I play like I want. So if it's not a teacher or someone that you respect, don't listen to people in general, I think, because it's such a personal thing when it comes to vibrato. And you have so many guitar players, they're loved for their vibrato and phrasing in general, but they are wildly different. So it's gonna be down to the ear of the beholder at the end of the day. All right, so that's the exercise. Hopefully that was clear. So what you want to do is you want to move this to different strings on different days. You can say on one string one day, or you can change the strings as you do the exercise. But just make sure that you do an equal amount for each finger, and obviously that you try this all over the fretboard and on all strings as well. I remember practicing this for 5 to 10 minutes a day for roughly a year, and it really helped my vibrato. So I highly suggest that you try this, but like with anything else, you need to do it and give it some time. But I think you'll see that once you start doing this for a while, the mechanics of the actual bending technique or vibrato technique becomes quite obvious, and it's very transferable to your regular playing after a while. But make sure you watch the video and you understand every aspect of it. If you have any questions, just post them below. And as always, I have a question for you. Who do you think has the best vibrato when it comes to guitar playing? Or actually, just put any instrument. So who do you think has the best vibrato overall? If you happen to be a new subscriber because of this video, please let me know in the comments below. Just write I subscribe, and of course leave your answer as well to your favorite vibrato question.